with reversing long-held positions, like the position that Trump didn't dictate.
And Jonathan, again, what lawyers would usually want to prove before a court, the president's own lawyers do for the Mueller team. You look at Rudy Giuliani. After he was questioned, and you can see it in the Washington Post today, after he was questioned about the president lying and the president's team lying about who dictated that letter on Air Force One, Rudy Giuliani then said, you see, that's why we don't want him to go under oath. Yeah, find me a federal judge in America that's going to look at that and not say the president has to comply with the subpoena.
Yeah, that was a rather curious argument. You know, the reason the president
because he basically said, yeah, everybody around the president, they're such liars that we can't go in front of Mueller. Well, it's a perjury trap.
Finally honest.
I mean, usually we try to serve our clients by doing excellent work. On this occasion, you're saying, you know, because we have made false statements, our client really shouldn't be called to the stand. And so that's something we don't normally see. It's right up there with the Comey statement. You know, we knew that they've been debating for a long, they had debated for a long time, what are we going to do with Comey? But we never thought that one of the options was a wood chipper. And so I think that, you know, that's not going to help either. Those types of headlines hurt you.
I need to follow up with that, too, really quickly, too, because we all, you know better than anybody, and that constitutional law has to bend to the facts before it, and this belief that a president can't be subpoenaed, or a president can pardon himself, or in this case, a president, if he wanted to, could assassinate an FBI director who was conducting an investigation against him, and he could not be indicted. Impeached, but not indicted. I got a feeling, again, that's something you would not want to put before 9 justices on the United States Supreme Court, that the law was, when it came to murder or even treason, that the law was what the president's party in Congress said the law was.
Right. I mean, look, law professors have debated this for decades as to whether a sitting president could be indicted. I happen to take the view that a sitting president can be indicted. I don't really put a great deal of strength in some of the arguments made by the other side. But what's fascinating is that the example given by Giuliani is the example that my side gives. Those of us who believe in limiting executive power often raise the issue of the president shooting someone in the Oval Office. It is not the example the other side wants to talk about. It's like going to a healthcare inspector and saying, you know, under these rules, I could poison my patient.